Great. So what I'll do briefly is review just to jog your memory on what we talked about last week. And then I have some kind of fresh content that we didn't get to go over last week to kind of finish last week's lecture and kind of round it out a little bit. And then we will proceed into a discussion of, what are the more positive implications of all of this. All right. So if you remember from last week, what we talked about was kind of the psychological landscape of contemporary social life in the larger kind of historical context of the trends that we've been talking about. Okay, and so I made a few kind of arguments to you last week. One is that most people are basically liars in ways that they don't fully understand, in ways that are quite unconscious, right? And most of this discussion revolved around the concept of motivated reasoning, where I kind of explained that for the most part, when people think and talk about politics, they're obeying a psychological process that they themselves do not fully understand, which is mostly emotional. It's mostly emotional. It's mostly system one, fast automatic thinking, and that is, we do that for deep evolutionary reasons about how our brain evolved to serve us in our ancestral environment. Okay. We talked about how for, the millions and millions of years in which our brain evolved over time through evolution, there was not much of a benefit from having a, really super accurate and rational, abstract conception of a particular analytical problem. There wasn't really much of a reward for that for almost all of the history of human beings. But what there was a reward for most of the history of human beings is, being able to react quickly to get away from, the snake in the grass right next to you. To be able to see that snake, to notice it, and to be able to step away from it super quickly. That was like, that type of problem was like one of the biggest main problems that human beings, had to solve, right, to live, right? So through millions and millions of years of mostly that kind of environment, right, or that kind of problem. Obviously, we're simplifying to an extraordinary degree. But when that is the biggest type of problem the human being has to kind of solve for most of its history over millions and millions of years, the brain, evolves in such a way as to be good at really fast, quick, automatic things, right, for its survival. That, of course, then when we enter into kind of communities and become tribal, as human tribes kind of evolve and develop, that kind of basic brain machinery, evolves into a kind of social entity, and so those basic kind of survival reflexes, that fast automatic thinking, it develops these sort of moral taste buds that basically have to do with what we find to be morally attractive or morally repugnant. Those are evolved kind of features of our psychology that, again, came out of millions and millions of years of a very particular type of, competitive ancestral environment. And so we have a few moral taste buds. We have moral emotions, right? We feel moral emotions about things because having those moral emotions served purposes in our kind of evolutionary history. Okay. So that's why most people are, when we talk and think about politics, we're misrepresenting what we're actually doing. Okay, we kind of pretend to be rational, abstract thinkers, trying to get to the truth of something and saying what we think is true, but that's not in fact what we do. Sometimes we do it in very rare, specific cases. We're capable of doing it, but it's super costly, it's super difficult, and it's actually it's not generally rewarded, right? Like if you do that with your friends and in your ideological groupings, you're kind of seen as like an annoying gadfly, right? For the most part, in most social settings, the radical truth is not really like welcomed. Most people don't want that. So we say things in a way that is basically designed to express our emotions, rationalize our emotions, defend our emotions, but also to be a good group member, to make the people around us like us, to be, strategically, to strategically promote ourselves, okay, is most of what we say most of the time. And that's true in politics, okay? So that's I tried to kind of explain that in a little bit more detail last time, how most people are liars because of this phenomenon of motivated reasoning. Okay? But also most people are incorrect. Like even when we try to understand what is the truth of a situation, even when we try our best, there are like dozens and dozens of well-documented ways in which we naturally go wrong. And again, that is because our brains were not, for the most part, evolved for hyper-accurate, abstract representations of analytical problems, but for these, more self-interested kind of survival interests, right? And so that's why we have all these cognitive biases. So even when we try to get things right, we generally, for many reasons and in many specific, well-documented ways, we tend to get things wrong. Okay. And so all of that was to kind of try to build a more scientific, psychological kind of basis for understanding, like what we all do when you look out into the world and you look at human beings thinking about things and making political diagnoses, whether it be in your own life or in your own group of friends or in the media, obviously. We want a more realistic idea of what the hell human beings are doing when we're out doing all of these things, right? And it ain't pretty. It's mostly they're trying to serve their own interests and in ways they don't understand, and they're usually systematically incorrect in ways that they don't understand, okay? Ourselves included, right? This isn't like I'm not like criticizing, most normal people, but I'm smarter than all of this and I see through all of this. No, I mean, I'm subject to all of these things too, even when you're aware of them, okay? So hopefully that gives you a very different kind of sense of the social and political world around you. And that's just kind of to build a base of like where the reality of human psychological and behavioral tendencies, okay? But of course, the reason why we're interested in that is to understand how all of the other stuff we've been talking about in all of the previous lectures, these larger technological and economic trends, how do those trends interact with this kind of psychological reality of who and what we are? All right, that is why we are talking about this, and that's why I went over the things I went over last week. So we didn't quite get to that part last week, so that's going to be most of what we spend most of our time on in this session, is talking about how these things interact with the information revolution to, I think, basically give you a really, I think, abstract but simple and useful way of kind of reconceptualizing most of our political problems today. And like I said before, in a way that I think points towards kind of radical alternatives or solutions for how we might kind of structure our lives or think about ourselves politically. All right, so that's just kind of to recap what we did last week and to put it in context for what we're going to do today. So we'll just go through all this. I'll let you see it quickly. We talked about System 1 versus System 2. We talked about morality. We talked a little bit about neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. Went over just some of the basics because I thought it was useful for you to know. We talked about how people have done actual brain scans of motivated reasoning. Like you ask people to think about politics and you give them contradictory information to what they feel, what they emotionally are drawn to. And the parts of the brain that are associated with emotion and hot automatic System 1 thinking, such as the VMPFC, they light up literally first before the cool rational parts of the brain can even get booted up. For instance, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the green one. So people have we know this in a kind of very material way. We talked a little bit about the difference between a kind of ideal, rational kind of intelligent kind of interaction with the world versus a politically motivated reasoning way of interacting with the world. Okay, and so in the kind of what is called the Bayesian, a simple Bayesian system, there is the natural world that gives us signals, right? And then, there is some magnitude and variability of that signal, which we compare to what we previously thought was going on, right? We all at all times, you understand this, right? We all at all times, we have some basic kind of pre-established belief about the world that we're in, right? But we get new signals all the time. And we're constantly comparing the new signals to what our previous belief was, and we're using the new signals to update our previous beliefs, okay, about the state of the world that we're in. Okay? And when this is totally open, when this is totally transparent and friction-free and working well, that's basically what an intelligent being is, right? An intelligent entity, whether it be a machine intelligence or a human intelligence. As we talked about the concept of intelligence in previous sessions, it is this kind of correctly calibrated relationship with the outside, is one way you could think about it, where you're constantly updating based on the signals that you're getting. That's intelligence. But politically motivated reasoning throws a monkey wrench into intelligence, in other words. I felt like I was a little bit unclear or awkward about this last time, so that's why I'm kind of taking a moment right now to go back over it, make sure I'm clear. That's the simplest way to think about it, is that political motivated reasoning is like a systematic confusion or sand in the machine of intelligence in some sense. And because this is a circular process, a process of feedback where you're in interaction with the environment and you're updating yourself based on the environment, and your basic sense of what the environment is, like what the state of the world that you're in, your basic sense of that itself changes over time. Because that's circular, if you throw in a monkey wrench, if you contaminate that circular process at any one point with error or falsity, then it can get reproduced, kind of over time, more and more, right? So, if I get a signal from the natural world, the world around me or the environment, whatever you want to call it, here it's called the natural system, but I see that in a way that's biased by my emotions, my political, predispositions, then I'm going to update my behaviors and my model of the world in such a way that in later stages of that game, that bias or error gets encoded into my most basic understanding of what the world even is. Okay, so I act on it, I invest in it, and then in later stages, I'm even more convinced that that's the state that the state of the world that I'm in, even if it's systematically wrong, because this outside influence is being kind of injected into the circular process. Okay. All right, so that's that. Then we talked about all of these different types of cognitive biases. There are dozens and dozens. We went over that. I gave you just a few examples of ones that have obvious implications for the media. So now I want to kind of expand a little bit, because I realized that I was, in particular, last week I was a little bit brief on this idea of moral foundations. Okay, so I have some new slides at this point that I want to kind of just I want to make sure that I kind of finish up this topic well and really kind of nail it for you, because it's super important for understanding political debates today and how people respond to the media and this sort of thing today. So here's a table out of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, where he's introducing his theory of moral foundations. Okay, and if you remember from last time, I talked about this verbally, but I didn't have slides on it last week. The basic idea is that human beings have different moral. We have a relatively set number of moral taste buds. Like, there are certain things that across cultures around the world make human beings feel moral emotions. And there are a few relatively separable, distinguishable dimensions in which human beings have moral attitudes. All right? And people differ in the strength of their moral taste buds. So just like some of you might have a taste for oysters, but other people will think that oysters taste disgusting. Just like there are we all have different tastes. And that's partially genetic, it's partially a matter of culture. Just like we have different food tastes, we have different moral tastes, meaning that some people will be more morally repelled by something, by a particular action, than other people might, okay? That's the basic idea of moral foundations theory. And these are the ones that I introduced last time, but I want to go over them in a little bit more detail here. Jonathan Haidt basically argues that there are 5 major foundations to morality. In fact, he later updates this, and he argues that there's likely a 6th, which is the liberty oppression dichotomy. But we're just going to bracket that for now, just to keep things simple. The 5 basic moral foundations are: 1, care harm; 2, fairness cheating; loyalty betrayal; authority subversion; and sanctity degradation. We'll just why don't we use the first word in each just to keep things simple? Care, is one, fairness, the other, loyalty, authority, sanctity. So the reason I wanted to include this table and spend a little bit more time reflecting on this is that is because this gives you a little bit more detail about where these came from. And I think I was a little weak on this last time, so I wanted to kind of back this up a little bit. In particular, the adaptive challenge. So as I said, as I kind of alluded to just a few minutes ago, the reason we as human beings have these different moral foundations is that it's because of evolution, right? In our ancestral environment, for most of the millions of years we have evolved, each one of these moral feelings has served an adaptive purpose. It has helped us survive, and that is why we have them. That is why we observe them in ourselves now, because we wouldn't have. In other words, you get the basic idea of evolution, right? Like, we wouldn't have made it this far over all of these years had we not have, if we didn't have these things in some sense. So for the Care Foundation, the reason we have to feel moral emotions about care, the reason we have to be morally repulsed by seeing, weak human beings in pain or suffering, is because if we didn't, we wouldn't really be able to raise children. So that is why we have it, because it helps us protect and care for children. A little subpoint for thinking about this is, it's not like you have to realize that the things that we find obvious, things that seem like obviously good or bad, it's not obvious actually. Like, you might say, of course if you look at a helpless little baby, like, of course that baby is cute, and if someone does something to hurt that baby, of course that's wrong, of course that's immoral. But where does our feeling of that come from, right? There is an evolutionary reason for it, and it's basically that actually raising children, raising infants is really difficult, and actually they're really, like, they're a pain in the ass. Babies cry a lot. They need you to do so much work for them. They're annoying, right? They keep you up all night. Sometimes they get really sick, and they make it's really difficult to raise an infant. It actually can make you really angry and upset and impatient, and it kind of sucks to, it's hard to do, right? Is the basic point. So if we didn't have moral emotions, if we didn't feel compassion, for that sweet, innocent baby, if we didn't love that baby, we might not care about raising it well. If it cries and keeps us up at night, we might throw it into the lake because it's annoying. Right? Like, we very well in our history might have had that kind of response to babies. But if human beings, didn't feel, if in our history there were human beings who had very, very extremely low, loading on the care harm moral taste bud, if you didn't have that moral taste bud, you would throw your baby in the lake if it cried too much, and then you wouldn't reproduce, so you wouldn't last, right? So all the people who are here in this room are here because for millions and millions of years, your ancestors didn't throw the baby in the lake when it got too annoying, because it cared for the baby. It was compassionate, right? So that's the Care Foundation. Okay, there are good reasons that we feel care towards the suffering, distress, or neediness expressed by one's child. Okay. And then I guess just kind of gives you kind of a greater sense. This table gives you a greater sense of why we have these things, and kind of how to think them through. So the characteristic emotion for care is compassion, and the relevant virtues are caring and kindness. So we'll also talk briefly about, let's talk a little bit about fairness, because fairness and care. So basically, if you remember what I told you from last time, the difference between liberals and conservatives, or lefties and righties, the difference between these two ideological camps is not really, about their different rational debates about politics. It's that they have different biological predispositions to moral phenomena. At least that's the argument. That the biological the biological moral taste buds doesn't explain every percentage of the variation, but it's one of the big predictors of what's going to make someone gravitate towards left-wing ideology and left-wing parties versus right-wing ideology and right-wing parties, is that these people have different moral taste buds. Like, their bodies and minds actually function differently about what they find morally repulsive. Okay, so remember what I told you last time, and I'll reiterate it here. The main distinction between people on the left and on the right in terms of moral emotions is that people on the left care much more about the care and fairness foundations. So if you have strong moral taste buds for care, you're really compassionate. You hate to see people. You hate to see people suffering. You find that really morally repulsive, and also you find cheating to be really, really morally repulsive, but you don't care so much about loyalty and authority and sanctity. You're going to be a left-winger, basically. And then you're going to come up with all these rationalizations, right? All these rational ideas about how, the welfare state is rationally really good for everyone, and how, it just makes more economic sense to redistribute the wealth and this sort of, you're going to come up with these rational explanations for why left-wing politics are good and correct and true. But that's basically that's your mind finding rational explanations for what is basically what you feel, the emotions that you have. Okay, that's Jonathan Haidt's model, basically. And what people on the right wing are, or people on the center and the right, are defined by basically thinking that all of these things are important. Okay, that's the basic difference between people on the left and on the right. So, right. This is just a little bit of data also from Jonathan Haidt's data that he's collected. This is based on a sample of more than 132,000 subjects, so a pretty massive data set. And it basically just reveals what I just said, but it kind of sums it up for you in a nice visual way. Basically, if you start with your eyes all the way to the left, you're looking at people who identify as very liberal, very left-wing. Each of the lines represents how they rated the importance of these different moral factors. Okay, so if you're all the way on the left, those people across this massive sample will say that care is super important to them and fairness is really important to them, but then they'll say loyalty, authority, and sanctity, not so much. That's not that important in morality, is what left-wing people will say. And then for each step you go farther to the right, that difference decreases. And so people all the way to the right, people on the center and all the way to the right, all of these things are more or less equally important to them. Okay. So this is really, really important, I think. I think this, if you really think about this, it's extremely illuminating about our contemporary political situation and a lot of contemporary political issues around, political polarization, but also around, there are a lot of just plainly baffling kind of phenomena going on today on the left and on the right that people on the right look at people on the left today and are genuinely so confused. People on the center, or even on people on the right, or even on the center, look at videos coming out of campus protests today, and they look at the words that young activists use and the behaviors that young activists use, and people on the center and the right are genuinely they have no idea what these new activists are thinking and feeling or where they're coming from. And the same thing I think is on the left too. People on the left look at Trump supporters and they're completely baffled. They don't know, they don't understand how people could love someone like Donald Trump. If you've ever looked at the subreddit, the Donald Trump subreddit, it's extremely fascinating. It's people who love Trump, not just like him, but are sycophantic lovers of Trump, and they just celebrate everything he does, and he's their idol. It's really interesting to look at. But if you're on the center or on the left, you really can't quite understand how these people are so pumped on someone like Donald Trump. So my point is that with this type of understanding, I think you'll find that it helps you decode a lot of what's going on. One good example I think is, what's a good example? Okay, so a good example of something that people on the right find totally baffling is take a specific practice that has kind of become very popular for left-wing activists this idea, which I'm sure you've heard of once or twice at least, this idea of trigger warnings, right? The idea that, or safe spaces, right? Very similar, right? But the basic idea is that, an increasingly popular idea on the left is that in university classrooms, such as this one, students should be told on the syllabus and, at the beginning of class about any sensitive information that might be shared in the lecture that might make people feel uncomfortable, especially people who have themselves perhaps suffered from particular traumas. Anything that might make someone feel triggered, that might trigger, a flashback or something like this to some traumatic experience. There is a kind of a movement, if you will. I don't think it's quite as strong here as it is in the U.S., and it's more strong in particular places for different reasons, which we don't need to go into. But the basic point is this idea of, that being called a trigger warning, that lecturers should basically prepare students and warn students of anything that might be, difficult for them to process emotionally. The idea that lecturers should be constantly kind of like, the people on the right see this as like coddling, right? And they find this like completely baffling. Like people, like normal people on the center and on the right are like, well, it's a university classroom. Like, of course there's going to be difficult material. There's going to be, talk of war and talk of violence, and history, political history is filled with, all kinds of horrors and atrocities and murder and rape and pillage. Like that is the nature of the history of political life. So of course you're going to be exposed to that, and of course it's a part of growing up that you learn to deal with that. Like this is very obvious to people on the center and on the right. So to have like this kind of faction in the left wing today be asking for something like trigger warnings or safe spaces, and they have these very particular kind of technical terms, it's extremely baffling. And then so people on the center and on the right make fun of it, and they don't fully understand it, and they oppose it, and so you can see how this like antagonism increases. But I think when you have this kind of background, this sort of this kind of psychological background for what are the real substrates of political ideology, and especially the differences between left and right, suddenly it's very, very easy to understand. It's very straightforward, right? Basically, you should understand these things now because, well, people on the left, what are they defined by? What they primarily care about is care. One of the things they really care about is care. They don't care so much about other factors such as loyalty, authority, or sanctity. So think about it. If your moral emotions are jacked up on the dimension of care, then you're going to specialize in thinking about how you can kind of change the environment around you in a way that is only really focused on minimizing the immediate suffering of people, right? And so you might come up with ideas like how you can minimize the suffering of your university classmates, right? And you don't really care if that impinges on other, competing values, because that's what you feel more than anything else. So suddenly that's just one example of many things I think you see today that become much easier to understand with this kind of more rigorous kind of psychological background. Okay, so that's just an example. In a little bit, we're going to kind of try to abstract and think about how these things play out more generally with kind of the information revolution. So I wanted to make sure that we nailed that. Okay, so that's the moral foundations theory, and just an example of why it's illuminating and useful. So what I want to talk about now a little bit is what the information revolution has done to our brains. So we want to talk a little bit about the scientific evidence that we have for. We're shifting gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the empirical and scientific evidence of what technology, and in particular kind of internet digital technology, has done to our actual thought processes, our capacities to sustain attention, to develop our own intelligence, to carry out complicated tasks, to learn things like this. But my voice is getting a little bit parched, and I think some of you might be getting a little fidgety. So this was probably a natural place to just chill for, let's say, 5 minutes, take a break, rest your attention and your eyes, use the loo if you need to or whatever, get some water, and why don't we jump back into it in 5 minutes? Does that sound good? So one of the books that I had you look at is The Shallows by Nicholas Carr, who's a very well-known journalist, who's very much known for kind of putting on the map in a fairly rigorous way. He's a journalist, not an academic, but The Shallows is a book that's pretty scholarly. well, it's not scholarly, I should say. It engages quite well with a lot of scholarly research, and it's well sourced. Okay, and in that book, he basically argues, which you should have got from the little bits I kind of had. I think I gave you the podcast, right? I think I put the book up. Did I not? If not, it's you can find it online. In any event, as I asked you to take a look at in one way or another on the syllabus, you were hopefully able to grok that the basic argument of that book, The Shallows, is that the internet is making us dumber, basically. And so I want to kind of go through that argument a little bit, talk about some of the data for that, and then we'll talk about other social and political implications, of how the information revolution has affected our brains in other ways. So let's just talk briefly about The Shallows and this kind of basic line of argumentation. So the idea is based a lot on this phenomenon of neuroplasticity, which is basically just a general term to refer to the fact that your brain is constantly kind of updating itself and basically rewiring itself to some degree based on environmental conditions. Okay, for a long time it was thought that the brain was relatively fixed. Like once it was done developing, your brain was relatively fixed. That scientists thought that for quite a long time. It was only quite recently that it was determined that this is not actually how the brain works, and that in fact your kind of neural circuitry can constantly be updated. Okay, and so obviously within constraints, right? But the basic idea, of course, is that if you spend every day for a long period of time doing a particular type of task, the actual circuitry of your brain is going to rewire itself to some non-trivial degree. Okay, and this can be a really good thing, just as it can be a really bad thing, depending on the conditions you're being subjected to. And one of the arguments that Nicholas Carr makes is that most of what we know of as civilization and everything that we generally value about modern society, our ability to kind of live together in a complex system that is productive and stable and allows us to all, at least not be killing each other all of the time and starving all of the time. Basically, civilization as we know it was made possible through a kind of rewiring of our brain that we did over time that was intimately related to literacy and things like reading books. So the basic idea here, folks, is that as we learned over time to be able to focus our attention, and that was a hard-earned kind that was a hard-earned achievement. The idea that we can sit down and read a book, for instance, for like an hour without moving our lips, without writing it down. We can read text for a whole hour, do nothing other than read a book for an hour, totally inside of our own mind, build a world inside of our mind, and kind of inhabit that world, and then also walk away from that book and have learned something new that we integrated into our memory. The ability to do that is developed over time through practice, through years and years of developing our attentional capacities, through, in other words, wiring our brain to be able to do that. Okay, that's the argument anyway, and that this has gone hand in hand with civilization. So you can chart out quite directly how the rise of literacy and things like the ability to read and write and to do this kind of focused mental task, the peculiar focused mental task that is symbolic manipulation with something like an alphabet. To be able to our ability to do that over time has been positively correlated with the other features of civilization, such as cities, let's say, the rise of city-states. The rise of, if you think about it, it makes sense, right? Like, how do you run a complex modern government, let's say? There are a few things you need to have at a bare minimum, and one of them is some type of, at least one class of people who can manipulate papers or file some sort of filing system, right? The census and statistics and this sort of stuff. The laws and the edicts that are written and sent out, across the citizenry. This sort of this basic pattern of a complex modern society with a complex modern form of government, you cannot have that if you don't have at least a class of people who are able to look at paper and do nothing else and manipulate and read and write. Okay, so the idea is that our capacity for basic literacy makes civilization possible, but then in turn, civilization also had a tendency to make our literacy even more possible. So again, it's another example, as there are many examples in this module, of positive feedback. Right? That's the basic idea. Okay, so that's kind of early modern history. Well, the rise of pre-modern history, let's say, and modernity in some sense kind of culminates in this quite triumphant capacity for literacy, and also a quite triumphant capacity for civilization. But with let's say postmodernity, or the subsequent effects of the explosion that modernity kind of represented, because remember this idea that modernity is this kind of extraordinary positive set of achievements and human power in some sense, but it gives rise to all of these other kind of explosive fragmenting tendencies, right, that we're now just kind of living through, that are often called postmodernity is one simple way you can kind of periodize that. But the basic argument that Nicholas Carr makes is that digital technology, and especially the internet, is basically unwiring this relationship in some sense, and that the attentional capacities that we've developed over a long period of time that have made civilization possible in some sense are being actively undone by the internet. Okay, so what we'll talk a little bit about is kind of specifically how that's happening, and what is the evidence of that sort of thing. Well, a few things. People have done. I mean, the book, if you want to know more about this, read the book. It kind of catalogs all of this different evidence. But I'll just kind of talk about a few bullet points. Again, there is brain scanning evidence. So you conduct a functional MRI. You actually put a human body into this big tubular machine, right? And you literally scan their brain while you have them do certain tasks. People have done studies where they put people in an fMRI and have them do internet tasks on their smartphone. So we have some sense of the actual material brain reality of internet activities compared to other types of activities. Okay, and interestingly enough, some of that evidence suggests that the internet is associated with kind of increased brain stimulation, and this kind of makes sense, right? Because if you're looking at screens and you're kind of moving really fast and you're able to do things like play complex video games, for instance, it makes sense that it can actually, in some sense, it can kind of stimulate your brain more than it would be normally. Okay, but there's also evidence that the particular parts of the brain that are involved with conscious self-control, that those parts get weakened relatively. All right. So yeah, there's kind of a school of research that does fMRI research, and so that's one source of evidence that the internet is having effects on our brain. Another one is people have done studies that look at the difference between text with links, hypertext, versus normal text, like in a book, right? So, and one obvious feature of a book is that it's just the book. There's nowhere else to go in some sense. Of course, one thing that characterizes the internet is that when you're reading internet articles, there are all these other things you could click on if you want to get more information, or to go to an advertisement or whatever it might be. And there have been lots of studies that have converged on the finding that text with hyperlinks, you're less likely to understand what you're reading. You're less likely to remember what you're reading. There have been multiple studies on this sort of thing that show that. Okay, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Because the basic idea is that if at any moment in your trying to understand something, you're able to basically exit that thing you're trying to understand and go to some other thing. Just think about it. It makes it less likely that you're going to follow through on the main thing that you're reading. It makes it more likely that, if you click on the second thing, then there'll be a link in there and you might click on a third thing. I'm sure you've all experienced this, right? Where like you're reading something on the internet and before you know it, you've clicked like 3 different links and you have like 5 tabs open, right? And you've read like the first 2 paragraphs of 5 different articles and you didn't finish any of them and you walk away from the computer hardly even remembering what you read, right? I think that's a very common experience nowadays. Okay, so that's the idea, is that link, this like culture of linking that is the internet, is actually really bad for your ability to pay attention and to comprehend things and to remember them, because it's so kind of fragmented and it's constantly inducing you to jump around. Okay, so yeah, there's lots of evidence of that. The same thing has been found also with just multimedia content versus text, purely textual content. So like if you read a text in a book versus reading the same text on a web page that has a video in it, that also has been associated with similar kind of negative effects on comprehension and retention. Okay, so and this is not obvious if you think about it, because for a lot of the time, people thought that the internet and things like hypertext linking would be, would supercharge our brains in some sense, right? And you can understand why people might think that, right? Like when you can click around to all this other kind of networked information, maybe that would just help us process even more. We'd be able to click all these links and we'd get this like supercharged, refined, networked understanding of the world. And we'd be able to integrate one topic to the next topic, and it would make us, smarter in some sense. You could think that. Well, at least as far as Nicholas Carr is able to show in his argument anyway, that sort of understanding or prediction has not turned out so well, and most of the evidence is kind of negative. Now, he has good to say, and it's important to remember that there are going to be certain benefits. Like there's always trade-offs to things, right? And in general, I think you can say it's a generally true fact that for all media innovations, for every kind of new media technology that changes the media environment, it's neither like fully good nor fully bad. It usually just it shifts our capacities relatively. So it's going to make us worse at some things, but maybe a little bit better at other things. So for instance, I think there's research showing that like video gamers, for instance, have a somewhat refined and improved kind of visual image processing or something like that. Like the speed with which they're able to do visual image processing is improved, right? I mean, that's very intuitive, right? It makes sense. So like if you're spending all of your time on a screen and you're like really good at shooting things and like playing this kind of visual game, it makes sense that those capacities would be boosted. But you have to think about what are the capacities that are being atrophied, right? And in most of these contexts, as far as Nicholas Carr finds, what gets atrophied is your kind of conscious, mature, detached capacity to sort of control your attention and to focus on one thing for a long period of time is basically the main thing that gets atrophied by all of these different kinds of digital ways of interacting with information. Okay. Just a few other bullet points before we move on. One problem with digital technology is the switching costs. So switching costs refer to the mental taxation, sort of, the mental tax you pay for just changing topics or tasks of any kind at all. Okay. So one of the cool things about reading a book, like sitting down with a book and just reading a book, is you're just immersed in this one thing, right? There's the page, there's text on the page. It's a totally uniform situation, and you can just consume the text, and it just flows. You're just in this world, right? That's in part the reason that you're able to kind of get lost in the world of a novel or something like that is because you're only doing that one thing, right? If that novel had like hyperlinks where you were like clicking onto YouTube videos, also you're every time you switch your attention a little bit, you're burning mental resources. Okay, so it limits your capacity to absorb information because you're burning some of your capacity on the simple act of switching, which is costly. Another bullet point is that multitasking is kind of a mythical term. We generally are not able to multitask. It's kind of a myth that people can multitask. You really only can do one thing at a time. And if you think you're doing multiple things at a time, you're not really doing multiple things at a time. What you're doing is you're rapidly switching between things, but you're paying a shitload in terms of the switching costs. So it's kind of a myth that you can juggle multiple things at one time. So if you think that you're for instance, let's say you think you're sitting down to write an essay, you have an essay due for one of your classes, but you also are going to have your email open, and you also are going to have a few tabs open in your web browser, and you also have the TV on. If you think you're going to do all of those things if you think you're going to write your paper while you're also doing all those other things, you're kind of lying to yourself. You're not doing all of those things at the same time. What you're actually doing is moving from one to the other, but every time you do that, every time you go from the essay that you're writing to look at the TV a little bit, to get back from the TV into the essay, you have to burn, glucose just to be able to do that. And it takes you more time to do that, and it takes you energy to do that, okay? So basically the idea is that multitasking is kind of a myth, all right? So all of these are all just a bunch of bullet points that all kind of converge on the same implication, which is that the contemporary kind of digital environment, whether it be a smartphone or a web browser, for the most part, sitting down to a screen to do any type of digital work today, is basically rewiring and atrophying everything that made us kind of powerful, human beings in the first place, that allowed us to make civilization and allowed us to make complex societies and to achieve all the extraordinary things that humans have achieved in history. The basic kind of neural pathways that make that possible are being destroyed by the internet environment, basically the digital environment. Okay, and it's making us dumber. It's making us less patient. Our ability to do one focused task for a long period of time is being atrophied. And what that means, in other words, is that if you're not able to control your time and to decide what you do to try to achieve some goal that you have set for yourself consciously, if you're not able to have that patience and that focus and that attention, another way of thinking about that is what it means is that someone else is going to be able to manipulate what you do with your time. Okay, and that is obviously kind of what the internet is, isn't it? It's for the most part, the internet is other people out there somewhere who are trying to absorb your attention and distract you and send you off into different places from where you're trying to go, right? You think you want to go to Google and find the answer to some historical question that you have, but maybe you think when did World War I start again? So you go to the computer to try to get something that you are trying to find out. That's what you think you're doing. But once you get onto the computer, actually there are literally thousands of other people out there who are trying to get you to do something else, and they're really damn good at it. And it really works, right? You go onto how often does this happen to us all the time? You go onto the internet to do one thing, and you literally, you get one step towards it, and before you know it, you're on Facebook, or before you know it, you're clicking on an ad or something like that, whatever it might be. And sometimes, how often does it happen? It happens to me all the time, where I literally forget what I got on the computer to do. And so, something like Facebook is like a system. It's an entire system that is designed to basically do that to you, to make you kind of unconscious of what it is you're doing, and to just spend as much time as you can in that system. Almost all website kind of interface design is all about how can they manipulate you to stay there as long as possible. That is what every website interface designer, that's the name of the game in that industry. Okay, so so that is a quick and dirty kind of summary of what the internet is doing to our brains in terms of attention. But this is also so not only is it making us dumber and more impatient and more manipulable, but that also has this sort of thing has concrete social and political implications or consequences. Before we even get into the more abstract question of trying to piece all of these different trends together that we've talked about this semester, There are more direct and easy kind of low-hanging fruit in terms of the consequences of this sort of thing. So there's lots of different books and kind of authors and stuff that we could talk about. But one in particular that I want to highlight for you is, so I'll talk about that in just a second. Real quick, just a piece of data on this particular about the point of how the internet makes us more impatient. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I wanted to throw it in. This is a graph from a study in 2012 about how the speed of our internet connection is associated with our patience, basically. I just thought it was kind of interesting. Wanted to share. So basically, the faster your internet is, the less your patience is, in some sense, for waiting for something to load. And so what this shows is that people who connect to the internet through a dial-up, old school dial-up. So on the sorry, I should just tell you what the actual graph is. So on the y-axis, the abandonment rate. What that measures is what percentage of the people will ditch the website that they're waiting to load, right? And the x-axis is how long that delay is, how long it's taking for a web page to load. So for every extra second that it takes a web page to load, people will decide, fuck it, I'm not willing to wait for this page to load. It's taking too long. It's not worth it. I'm gonna just nix it and move on to the next thing. That's what this is showing. Is when people decide to not wait for the damn thing to load. And what this is showing is that if you use dial-up connection, old school dial-up connection, you're willing to wait a long time, and that makes sense because it's slow, right? You're not used to it going that fast. So since it's really clunky and old-fashioned, and everything kind of takes a long time, you're not going to quit that easily. But if you have a fiber optic connection, you have lightning quick internet. If there's if there's something even slightly wrong with the connection and it's taking a little bit longer than usual to load, you're going to be I can't wait, it's not worth it, never mind, and you're going to cancel out the page. And I think this resonates, right? I know in my experience, as the internet has gotten faster and faster, I become more and more entitled to getting information quicker. Okay, and so it's if you have really good internet, how often do you there's some sort of delay in your internet connection and it's taking a really long time to load, and after if it takes 2 seconds longer than usual, you find yourself getting antsy. You can feel yourself getting frustrated because the page is taking 3 seconds to load instead of 0.5 seconds to load. That actually bothers you. I know that feeling, and it's so ridiculous because 10 years ago it took longer than that to load, and I was just fine with it, right? Okay, you get the basic idea here, folks. The point is that as our connections and ability to get information becomes faster on average, you can get whatever you want really quickly. That seems really good, right? But it's bad in the sense that it makes you really antsy and impatient if things take a long time. So this has real effects. Think about it. One way to think about this is, sorry, let me take something. I find, students today are much worse at using library resources than they used to be. I'm totally convinced of this. And I think it's because going to find a book in the library takes some time, right? It's kind of it's an old-fashioned kind of brick and mortar process where you have to find the calling card, and you have to go to the shelf, and then you have to look through the books, and it's difficult and taxing, and it's takes time. And most of us are used to just Googling something and getting it right away instantly. So we are less willing and less able and less patient in doing kind of the hard work of getting information that's not immediately available. Okay, so that's just kind of what this represents. All right. So let's talk now a little bit more about the social and political implications. We've already talked about the shallows. Just some other work I want to kind of make you a little bit familiar with is the work of Jean Twenge, who is a social scientist who kind of specializes in kind of long-term historical changes in kind of psychology and sociology. and she's really, really good. She's like written really a lot of really important kind of how should I say, relevant and kind of timely books about basically how like different generations and cult and how should I say about how like our culture and psychology and sociology has changed for different generations in the past several decades. Okay, and one of her books is called iGen, and it basically focuses on the generation of people who the first generation to basically have smartphones from the beginning of their adolescence onward. Okay, so I guess it's gonna be many of you. I think so. I believe she marks what she calls the iGen, this generation, the first generation to have smartphones from their adolescence. I think she says that she defines it as beginning in with people that were born in 1995, right? So when were you all born? Can you shout it out? 96. A few more, shout it out.
97.
Okay, yeah, so she's literally talking about you guys. So that's one reason why I suspected that this would be very interesting to you. So that's kind of interesting to think about, that you folks were basically the first group of human beings in the history of the world to basically have smartphones for your like coming of age, from being like a child to transitioning into adulthood through adolescence, to have, you were kind of the first batch to have smartphones in that period. Okay, so she's done lots of research. She's a really good social scientist, really proper kind of statistical social scientist, and she has lots of good data on all different kinds of things over time, basically. And so she wrote this book about how your generation is different, basically, than previous generations, and it's pretty alarming, and it's something that I think you guys should be really reflective about, to think this through, because the picture is generally not very pretty. It's not like criticizing you or anything like that, so much as kind of emphasizing really the ways in which like you suffer more than previous generations, because your environment is different, because the conditions that you're growing up in, that you have grown up in, are different than previous generations. And so the quick and dirty of her general thesis is that the generation that grew up with smartphones in their adolescence are less independent, less rebellious, less social, and that it has a lot of quite deleterious kind of emotional and psychological effects. So like your generation is more depressed, for instance, more sleep deprived, more suicidal, things like this. You're less likely to see friends in face to face, these sorts of things. Okay, and so actually I put in I'll let her speak in her own words. I put this little link to just a short 5-minute video so I can give my voice box a quick rest. And this is a video that has some graphs and stuff in it, so I thought it was kind of useful to have a look at. So this will give you just a quick 5-minute little clip. It'll show you some more specific examples of what she's talking about. And she argues that the effect is basically from having smartphones.
The name of the book, rather, iGen. It goes on sale next Tuesday. That's August 22nd, wherever you like to buy the book.
I used to use the end when you made the screen here.
Thank you.
So first, today's tech, the dramatic effects that digital devices can have on today's tech-savvy kids. It's called iGen, Why Today's Super Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood, and what that means for the rest of us. Oh boy, lots of work. Author and psychologist Twenge coined the term iGen for kids who were born between 1995 and 2012. This is the first generation to spend their entire childhoods with smartphones and social media. Twenge reveals they are getting less sleep, postponing sex, and even delaying getting a driver's license.
So the book is published by Atria, that's an imprint of Simon & Schuster, which, by the way, is a division of CBS, and Jean joins us at the table. Hello, Jean.
Hello.
We all sort of are clutching our pearls about their denying their driver's license, because didn't we guys, when you turned 16?
So wanted.
Yeah, it was the first thing you wanted to do was go to the DMV, but you said they delayed the driver's license, they don't get a summer job, they're delaying sex, they're hanging out with their parents. What is happening?
Does this ring true for you? I'll ask you
So
after.
it's so common for people to say, oh, you know, kids are growing up so quickly these days.
You say growing slowly.
But they're growing up more slowly, so in teens. So 18-year-olds now look like 15-year-olds used to in terms of the things you mentioned, like getting a job and driving.
Do they act like 15-year-olds, 18-year-olds?
Well, in some ways they do. They just haven't had as much independent experience. But yeah, the driving one really struck me too. There was one young man who told me, well, I didn't get my driver's license because my parents didn't push me to get my license, which to a Gen Xer like me, wait, what are you talking about? It's the other way around. It's the kid pushing the parent.
So is it smartphones the cause or something else?
So with this trend of really growing up slowly, there's a bunch of causes going on. It's a really broad cultural trend with drinking alcohol less and not getting a job and not dating as much, not having sex during high school. Its overall development has just slowed down, that teens are just taking longer.
Why?
So the why question is always a little hard to answer with this, but it's probably, at least partially because people have smaller families, they expect their kids to go to college, they nurture them more carefully, and then these trends started to accelerate with the smartphones. A lot of them have to do with getting out of the house. And when you're talking to your friends all the time, when the party's on Snapchat, you don't have to drive as much or go out without your parents as much.
I thought this was fascinating. You write of the iGen's mental health, quote, there's not a single exception. All screen activities are linked to less happiness, and all non-screen
Really serious.
activities are linked to more happiness. That's the research?
Yeah, so if you look at these big national surveys of teens that ask them what they do with their time, so things like homework, sports, reading, getting together with their friends, all of those non-screen things, they're all correlated with greater happiness. And think about anything that's done with a screen, texting, social media, TV, online, peer games, all of those are correlated with lower happiness.
You talk to so many iGens all around the country, and one of the reasons you say it's important to do that is to talk to this group at the same age, so you get it from them rather than older people comparing what they're going through.
Right.
What was your overall takeaway when you talked to the different groups and compared them to the millennials?
Yeah, so I drew from survey data on 11 million young people. It's been collected since the 60s and 70s. Then about 200 in-depth surveys, and then about 25 who are interviewed in-depth. And really, I think the smartphone is one of the keys in explaining why they're so different from millennials. So, for example, that their mental health has really trended downwards, starting around 2012.
Should they have smartphones?
Well, that's the question, right? So if you look at that link between smartphones and unhappiness or suicide risk factors or depression, what they suggest is it doesn't really harm to spend, say, up to an hour or even an hour and a half a day with a screen, but 2 hours and beyond, that's when you start to see the link to these mental health issues.
That's interesting, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. One quick question, how did you change your own behavior with your kids?
Yeah, so the day I analyzed that data, looking at screen time and unhappiness and depression, I took my kids' tablets and put them in a drawer.
So there's a lot of flip phones at your house. They don't like you.
They just even like it.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, really, this is really important. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so you got the idea.
The name of the book, right, iGen.
So actually, this is so I hear a lot of chatting, so that's a good sign that you found this stimulating. So this would be actually a good place to just pause, and I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts. Like, does that ring true for you, or what do you think?
I don't think I know anyone who she's describing in my age range.
What do you mean?
In terms of just saying that people, I don't know, aren't going out as much, I don't know, aren't as social or don't have jobs, summer jobs and stuff like that. I think most of my friends, maybe it's just a group that I associate with, but I don't know anyone that she was describing in that sense.
Right. Well, a few things to keep in mind. One thing is that she's not saying you all never get around to doing that, but that you do it later. So like what she said was like, that's all. That you do it much later. So yeah, but that's one thing. And the other thing is, it's kind of hard for you to have a sense of this from your, like, because it's comparative historically, right? So, like, you might look around and say, oh, I know lots of people who go out with their friends and play sports and, have sex, right? And that might be true. Of course, you know people who do all of those things. But what she's saying is that based on the data, which is more, quite reliable, you all do it more, you do it less often than like your parents would have done it, let's say, at that age. So that's something that, so like that's just something to keep in mind. But what do the rest do you think? You're sort of at this point, you're kind of all a little bit past the age that she's talking about. Like she's really interested in like high school students and like a little bit earlier than you folks. I mean you folks kind of, but so think more about like your kind of your experience, like in when you were like 16 or 17. She's more kind of describing that period. Like you all were basically doing these things less often and later at that time of your life. Now you might do them more or whatever. Go ahead.
There's a difference between countries as well, because as a comparative,
sure.
Like I think like the amount of people who have smartphones is the same. Like in Estonia, where I come from, and the same in the UK. But definitely, I was shocked because of the fact that when I came here, Freshers started, and I met so many people who were drunk for the first time in their lives, and it made me laugh because of the fact that I know that like that came like years and years before for us.
Okay.
So that was definitely something in terms of countries. So maybe what she's referring to is a trend more of like you're well kind of the countries that are more well off can afford to be more like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
The parents are working less, so more time for the children, etc., etc.
Yeah, good points. Anyone want to add anything? Yeah.
I can relate to sort of driving thing.
Yeah.
Because I remember, like amongst like us lot back home, it's like I knew a lot of people that have a lesson like on their 17th birthday. Whereas I don't think I got my provisional until about 3 months after I turned 17. I really delayed it.
You just didn't care that much?
I should have done, because like when I actually went to uni, I regretted not being able to get a test in time because I delayed it so much. Whereas but at the time, I guess when I turned 17, it didn't bother me as much.
Yeah.
I do.
That's interesting. Thanks for sharing. And does her explanation kind of ring true to you? Like, do you think it might be in part because, you sort of already have your mates on your phone and you kind of don't need to worry that much about it? Yeah.
I guess it's possible, yeah. But it was really a lot of my friends started driving straight away, and a lot of them delayed it. It was really
Yeah.
So there wasn't really a clear reason why that might have been split there.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else want to comment on how this rings true or doesn't ring true? Personal examples or anything you want to share? Well, okay, so that's the gist of it, and so the basic point is that our smartphones do very likely, this evidence suggests, make us less happy, more depressed, more anxious, even more suicidal, and that in some sense you all are suffering from that as a whole more so than previous generations because you came of age with these things, right? So it's something to really keep in mind, especially just in a practical way, especially the stuff around mental health. Statistically, a number of you in this room right now might be suffering from, pretty serious personal, psychological, mental health challenges of different kinds and different, intensities. And so the point is to reflect on how, if you're suffering from mental health or people, your friends or classmates that are suffering from serious mental health issues. Obviously, these things are complicated. There are often multiple factors. So I'm not being overly general about it, but very likely, the prevalence of serious mental health problems in you folks and your classmates, some of that is an effect of your overexposure and early exposure to basically digital technology in the form of the smartphone in particular. Okay, so that's what her data suggests, and so this is extremely political. It's extremely political, right? That these digital technologies affect us and affect our powers, like our ability to actually flourish in life. You know, to do great things, right? And to have energy and to feel joy, right? These sorts of things are being affected by techno-economic processes that are, you know, larger than us. Okay, so that's the point, and they affect us differently, right? So if you're able to, so for instance, like people that are learning this, for instance, like let's say highly educated parents, for instance, who read books, who read John Twenge, and know now that like smartphones mess people up. They might choose now to give their children less exposure to smartphones, which will make them more healthy and more empowered in the future, right? But less educated parents who don't know this, and they work so much just to get by, so they don't really have the time, they don't have the energy to really, like, you know, put a lot of time into parenting and things like this. Their kids are going to be increasingly kind of raised by the smartphone. I mean, I'll tell you an interesting personal example. Last time I went home to see my family, my family's, you know, very good people, but my parents don't have a lot of money, and they never had a lot of money, and they they're not they don't have much education, and so they my brother recently had a daughter, and my parents kind of like help a lot with taking care of them, and whatever. So that's the backstory. So my parents basically are kind of like helping parent a lot. So yeah. But I went home to see last time I went home to see my family. My little niece, her name is Avery. She was 3 years old at the time, and I was like completely stunned by her like use of like the iPad that they have in the house. Like my brother has an iPad or whatever, and she uses it like nonstop. Right, so it's like John Twenge thinks that you folks had it bad by, you know, having smartphones in your adolescence. I'm like really worried about the generation that is growing up with iPads from, you know, their infancy. I mean, it's insane. Like what I saw my niece Avery doing, it really horrified me. So like I'll just spend just a few minutes telling you because it's a pretty interesting story. Like I don't know how many of you have seen like a toddler use an iPad. But if you watch closely, I mean, it's like it's quite bizarre. So like, you know, she can barely like say anything. That's like, she can barely put together like meaningful words. But she's able to like work the iPad, and her like favorite thing is YouTube. Like kids YouTube is like a huge industry. Just videos for kids. But like the videos that they actually watch are really weird. So you might have heard of like Hellscape, which like was in the news recently. Yeah, so that's one story of like extremely twisted problems with like kids' videos on YouTube. But this was like last year, so this was before Hellscape, before anyone even knew about Hellscape, or you know the problem of that. You know, like her favorite things to watch on YouTube, like her saved channels that like she would watch, were like you know, basically other people playing with toys. And this is the first time I ever heard of that or saw that. And I mean, have you heard of this? Do you know about this? It's not, when I first saw it, I thought my niece was just like really weird. Like, how did she find, like, how on earth did she find this and get hooked on this? But no, it's common. It's a huge market. It's a huge industry. It's like a whole genre of YouTube videos that young kids love to watch. And it's literally other people like playing with toys. You set the camera up, you film yourself playing with toys and kind of doing a voiceover like, oh, Johnny, yeah. And the video is other people playing with toys and kind of doing these like stupid voiceovers. She would just sit there and watch that for ages. In fact, it was so like what she would do. She had the system totally worked out. What she would do was she would like go lie on the couch, right? She would like I'll try here. She would like lie on the couch on her side like this, basically. With her head on the pillow, and like, you know, like a bottle in her mouth, like, and she would set the iPad up, so she's like facing into the couch, so like the back of the couch is right here, and she would lean the iPad up against the couch, so the iPad is facing her just like this, so she wouldn't even have to hold it, and she would just play the video, sucking on her bottle, and watching other people play with toys. She would do this for like hours on end, and I found that so horrifying. You know, but the reason I mention this is that you know, if smartphones have this sort of effect on your generation more so than previous generations, what the hell is going to happen to people like my niece Avery, who grow from infancy with that kind of like relationship to technology? I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen, but I found that like very troubling. Okay, but the reason I mention this though, and the reason I give you this particular example is because, you know, my parents are great people, love them, really, really good, honest, hardworking people. So I'm not talking shit about them at all. But they don't have a lot of money, okay, and they don't have a lot of education, right? So they're not reading Gene Twenge's book, right? They're not thinking about this sort of thing. As most working people like aren't thinking about these abstract political effects and of technology, right? Like it's just not what most people think about, let alone kind of like reflectively strategize about how to improve themselves on, right? So, and they don't have a lot of time or energy because they're like working and busy with all kinds of other stuff, right? So my point is that for people like my parents, this is like the way that my niece uses the iPad is like very useful, right? Because she entertains herself. It makes it easier, like, you know, it's like, it serves a purpose that is disproportionately kind of useful and attractive to people who like don't have the time and energy or the knowledge to think about what's going on there. Do you see what I'm saying? But if you're educated and you read books and you've read John Twenge's book and you make a lot of money so you can, you know, afford for one of the parents to not work and stay at home with the kid, you know, that parent might say, okay, you know, you're not allowed to do that with the iPad all day, and we're going out into the woods to go on a walk because it's going to make you healthier and smarter and happier in the long run, right? Like, okay, you get my idea. You get the point here, right? That basically the effects of these things are going to be stratified by things like education and by things like class. Okay, that's something that's like really important to think about. Okay, that these things aren't going to affect us all different equally, and you might use that to kind of help decode your own experiences, perhaps. Okay, so that's that. So basically, you take this cluster of things together. This stuff by Nicholas Carr on the Shallows about how the internet is making us dumber. It's ruining our capacity to kind of hold attention for long periods of time, and in turn, that's making us more manipulable. And then you look at the work of people like Gene Twenge about how, you know, this is like fundamentally making, you know, human cultures different that in a way that you can kind of see by tracing out the different generations that have exposure to this technology. In ways that have direct effects on mental health, and you know, this is kind of why I titled this lecture, you know, the psychological hellscape of postmodernity, because when you take all of these things together, it's a really pretty frightening picture, isn't it? So we have different moral emotions that we don't even realize we have. Almost all of our political thought and speech in public is like a deceptive misrepresentation of biological processes that we don't fully understand, right? That leads us into different political camps, different ideological groups, and different political parties and things like this. But then, at the same time, technology is making us even more impatient, less able to think really hard and critically about one thing at one time for a prolonged period of time. It's making us more manipulable. It's also making us suffer more. It's kind of it's weakening our energies, basically. In other words, it's weakening our power. In other words, and that's why it's political. Okay, so all these things are happening at once. We have this kind of psychological basis that's already makes us lie to each other in ways we don't even understand. It makes us incorrect and erroneous in ways that we don't fully understand. But then the internet comes along, right? And the information revolution and all of its implications, smartphones, the internet. That's why, by the way, folks, this is why I talk about, the information revolution and not just like the internet or smartphones or, it's why I use this kind of general term of the information revolution, because in some sense, all these screens, like she was saying, like the difference between screen activities and non-screen activities is the relevant distinction in some sense. It's not about like, the internet per se or the smartphone per se. It's about this whole cluster of kind of digital screen culture, right? And that's all a kind of downstream of the information revolution, as I've kind of contextualized it in previous sessions. These things are having profound effects, and now what we really want to think about is how these things interact with, how these specific effects that we're looking at in this slide, how these things interact with the moral psychology that we went over. Okay, because so that's basically what we want to do next. And so if we think about it, one thing that the increase in information processing has done is that it decreases the practical necessity for what I would call kind of intergroup reality calibration. And what do I mean by that? It sounds technical. It's really not that. It's not that technical. But the point is that people talk about echo chambers a lot, and that's a kind of common idea that the left is in an echo chamber. They only expose themselves to information they already believe in, which makes them believe in it more. You get that basic idea. It's quite well known. And I think that kind of misses the point, to be honest. It's not so much the echo chamber problem. It's the fact that it's the much more radical problem that with our kind of highly sophisticated information processing power that we have today, it's not just that you're able to go into an echo chamber where you only see ideas that you already believe. It's the much more radical problem that there never comes a time when you have to calibrate your sense of the world with other people at all, like in practice, right? So what it means is that with digital technology, you're perfectly allowed to have a totally unrealistic sense of the world for as long as you want. There never comes a time where you have to kind of like calibrate that with what other people have a sense of the world about. Do you see what I'm saying? So like back in the day when we didn't have these like digital platforms, you periodically had to interact face to face with people and do things with people, right? And what that has done for most of human history is it sets like a limit on how insane you can become. When you have to kind of talk to other people and do things with other people in a physical, realistic environment. If you get too insane in your model of the world, you're going to get directly kind of punished socially, because people are going to look at you and they're going to look at you like a crazy person with your crazy ideas. Okay, but nowadays that moment never comes. Like you can have the looniest ideas about the world, and it might never really be a problem for your ability to basically live. Because so much of what we do today is in this purely kind of digital space. So that's what I mean by reality calibration. That for most of human history, what reality even is a kind of, it's something that you learn by what you have to by negotiating it with others in some sense. You're kind of constantly calibrating it with what other people think, but that reality calibration basically has been to a significant degree removed. Okay, but another thing that I think is people have not thought enough about is that the our sort of newfound kind of extraordinary information processing power that we have today. One effect that it has that's really important for thinking about politics is that it decreases the size threshold for effective political communities. And so what do I mean by that? Again, it sounds kind of complicated, but it's not. What I mean by that is that, like, how many people have to exist that share a particular political ideology for that particular political ideology to become like a livable community? The number of people required for that has shrunken to an extraordinary degree, I think. And I don't think that this has really been fully understood by many people, to be honest. So if you think about like the main divisions between like left and right, this kind of unidimensional political space, like this has been around since the French Revolution as a kind of general overarching dimension that basically separates political attitudes. Well, you might ask, why is there like this one dimension, left and right, that has defined so many societies for so many years since the French Revolution? One reason is because it's like a simplifying device, right? And surely within the left and the right, there's all this diversity of ideas. You can find much smaller groups, people on the left who are different than other people on the left. You can drill down and find all this diversity. But for most of human history, our technology was not refined enough for those people to like find each other, right? And to surround themselves with each other. So in some sense, because of the limitations of technology for most of modern history, the size threshold for an effective kind of political grouping was quite high. So think, so that's the basic idea. But that's, I think it's shrunken extraordinarily. So nowadays it's like, and this is why, folks, I think you see such a confusing kind of proliferation of political ideas and groups today right now. So it's like, if you think about like the alt-right, right? Or like, people on the left, there's like all these different types of people on the left, right? There's like social democrats, there's people who support Corbyn, there's people who don't support Corbyn, there's people who, the social justice warriors, right? These like different particular groups, and they all kind of disagree with each other, right? Well, this has proliferated, and I think it's because nowadays, like, there only needs to be like 1,000 of you in the world for you to be able to like have your own little culture, because you do it on the internet, right? So this has allowed for an extraordinary fragmentation, okay? I think information processing power has increased the instrumental rewards to those who are able to reduce their own biases. We might add to this also, people who are able to sustain their own attention, people who are able to avoid the traps of, the shallows, as Nicholas Carr identifies them. People who, even though we have smartphones and internet, they still read books because they, for whatever reason. People who are able to read books, to write books, to focus on one thing for a long period of time, even though the internet and the smartphones have kind of decimated that for most other people. People who are able to understand cognitive biases and the limitations of their own, moral taste buds. Basically, what I'm saying is that the small number of people who have been good at sustaining these kind of human powers against the onrush of digital, atrophy, they are paid for it, in other words, both monetarily, but also in terms of cultural power, because most other people are kind of being manipulated by forces that they don't know how to kind of contend with, right? So, like, think about the millions of people who go on Facebook and spend like 4 hours a day on Facebook, just kind of clicking around this environment that is designed to manipulate them, and it's designed to make them waste their time in it. Compare those millions of people to Mark Zuckerberg, right, who like is sitting at the top of it, making millions and millions of dollars, because when he was in university, he was able to like focus on one project for a long period of time and carry it through to completion, right? Mark Zuckerberg was not himself, on his smartphone pissing away the time. He was able to sustain attention on something specific and achieve something significant, and then he was able to follow through on it. So people who are able to do that nowadays and have the kind of the resources to do so make millions and millions of dollars because most other people are not able to do that. So it's like the world is bifurcating into people who are able to control their attention and the most people who are not able to control their attention. Okay, I think that has become a significant and extraordinary kind of cleavage. And this last bullet point is kind of just a follow up on. It kind of says the same thing as the first one, but it increases the power of cognitive elites to manipulate less cognitively powerful. So that the first one is about. Yeah, so those are kind of the same. Okay, so now, of course, I've gone and done it, and we're out of time already. Always running over time, but that's okay. That's why we have next week's session. But the question is, and this will be the last kind of thing that we discuss in this module, is how might our conception of political life change based on these realizations? And I was hoping that I'd be able to at least foreshadow how I think that's going to happen, but I don't want to rudely keep you beyond the time that I'm supposed to let you go. So you'll just have to wait until next week. All right. Thanks, everyone.